So speaking of the anti-war sentiment, it's going to deeply divide America, and we've never really seen this before to this extent during a war. We see the hawks or the pro-war people versus doves, and those are anti-war people. We've used these terms before, if you remember, all the way back to the War of 1812, hawks and doves. But we've never really talked about people not supporting a war that America was in. Sure, we've had isolated incidents where, like Henry David Thoreau wasn't, for the Mexican-American War. But the world wars and through imperialism and through the Mexican-American War and the Revolution, Americans have always supported their wars because there was something unifying them, whether it be a Pearl Harbor, the Lusitania, the Alamo, or the British and all the things they did up in Massachusetts during the Revolutionary era. So we haven't really seen something like this polarizing the nation like the Vietnam War. And you can see a lot of students get involved, okay? And that's what the middle of the slide is about here. The students getting involved not only in the civil rights movement, like we talked about last week, but also the anti-Vietnam War effort movement. So students very vocal about, their views on this war. You're also going to see the women's rights movement be revived during this time. We already mentioned Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, how she's questioning why it is women were reverting back to that 1950s home place, the cult of domesticity, the Republican motherhood ideas. But she wants to continue that conversation as far as why women are not pushing for equal rights and equal pay in the workplace. And then finally, at the bottom there, the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots are about the modern day gay rights movement, which is obviously still going on. And this is just to give you an idea that there are many movements during the 1960s and 70s that are ongoing, whether it's civil rights, whether it's the Vietnam conflict, whether it's women's rights, whether it's American Indians, Latino farm workers, or the gay rights movement. So a lot of things, a lot of movements going on at the same time. Very controversial era. Just to give you some insight, to all of the thinking and how people are voicing their opinions during this time period. You can certainly go through my slides more in depth, and you'll see more facts here. You're just seeing, some of the things that we dropped, used in Vietnam to wipe out the jungle. Very harmful for the environment, very harmful for people to ingest these things. A lot of side effects, a lot of toxins. Because we believe if we wiped out the jungle, then we can see our enemy, and that lessens the guerrilla warfare aspect. Here on the slide, the right-hand slide, you see the little red dots there. That's South Vietnam, and all those little red dots are the military bases of the Americans and how we were simultaneously attacked at all of those places in the Tet Offensive. And again, Americans were very upset how this happened. They were being lied to. So 1968 was an election year, and the Tet Offensive is kind of like that nail in the coffin for Lyndon Johnson to get reelected. So he knows he's not going to be reelected. He doesn't even run. He says, I'm out. I'm done. This was, a mess. And upon other things that happened in that same year, you have Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. You have JFK's brother, okay, RFK, who was assassinated. And during, right before he died, he was running to be president. And people thought, oh, wow, this is great. JFK's brother, and a return to what they call the Camelot years. And they wanted to see him be president. Who knows? Tet Offensive, Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr., and then finally riots. Okay, a lot of those riots we just previously mentioned. One riot breaks out in particular in the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. You read about this in your homework, and they will nominate the Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, to be the Democratic nominee. However, we do know that he's not going to win. But outside the convention is kind of like a microcosm of how America is bursting at the seams during this time period, and all the riots and all of the violence going outside. Now, Humphrey runs up against two conservatives. The one conservative is an ultra-conservative, George Wallace. He is running under a third party called the American Independent Party, and they are very against desegregation of society. Interesting. Okay, stuff we talked about last week, desegregating society, civil rights. He's very against that. He's very against the people who are saying don't support the war in Vietnam, and he's also very against the Great Society programs. So he is an ultra conservative, kind of too extreme for people. So people more likely will align themselves with Nixon, who is the Republican nominee. He is conservative, but not as conservative as George Wallace. So Nixon, we know this guy. He's been around for a little while. We learned of him putting people on the stand for the House of Un-American Activities Committee during the Second Red Scare, and people like Alger Hiss were sentenced to death and put away because of being communists. Alger Hiss was that former advisor to FDR, and later on Nixon goes on to be VP to Eisenhower. He runs for president in 1960, but will lose to JFK. Well, now he's back in 1968, and he runs, and he is going to win, and he's going to have a bunch of policies that Americans are going to be in favor of during this time period, during this Vietnam era. So here we have Nixon and his boy Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State. Their plan to end this whole conflict in Vietnam is what they call peace with honor. They want to end the conflict, but they don't want to just leave Vietnam. They want there to be some honor in it for Americans. And what Nixon truly believes is that he is the voice of the voiceless. He calls the American public the silent majority, meaning that most people in America are supportive of the war effort, but they just don't voice their opinion, right? They're not the ones that are going out and rioting. So he believes that he knows what's best into how to end this whole conflict. So what kind of things happen now that he is in office? One of the biggest things that happened the year he's elected is called the My Lai Massacre. Yes, My Lai. And this is in 1968, but it doesn't surface until 1970. That's 2 years, or really a year and a half into Nixon's first term. Now, what happens here at My Lai is that there are U.S. troops that kill an entire village, basically of women and children in Vietnam. This is obviously not good PR. This is not good. This is going to cause an uproar in American society once we find out about this. So this is not good. This is going to lead to that distrust in our government. Once again, another example. So what's Nixon's plan here about Vietnam? How's he going to get us out? He's going to use what he calls the Nixon Doctrine. And the Nixon Doctrine is kind of similar to what we talked about in the past, like the Eisenhower Doctrine or the Truman Doctrine. But instead of using troops to solve our issues, specifically in Asia here, that's Nixon Doctrine in Asia, he's not going to tell countries in Asia that we are going to give them our troops to solve their issues. So he wants to continue and honor our commitments to places like Vietnam, but they can't count on our troops, which Americans are glad to hear. So now we're going to see America start to pull out of Vietnam, and that kind of what is called Nixon's Vietnamization policy. Now, what Vietnamization means is that Nixon wants to slowly withdraw our troops and bring this conflict to an end. But while he is trying to end this war through his Vietnamization, he is actually escalating the war, but he doesn't tell Americans. So what's going on behind the doors is he is secretly bombing the two countries that are next to Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, not just because he feels like it, but because what the North Vietnamese are doing is they're taking the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which you may remember, and they're going through these two neutral countries to get to South Vietnam to reinforce the troops there that are fighting the Americans. And so this is why Nixon is going to expand the war secretively and start bombing these two countries. Now he does it secretively, so once Americans find out, they are extremely upset that he is widening the war but meanwhile he claims to be ending it at the same time. In response to this, you're going to see a lot of student protests. Two examples in Kent State and Jackson State. These are two different campuses, Ohio and Mississippi respectively, where students are going to protest the expanding of the war to Laos and Cambodia, but then they're going to be met with the National Guard, who's going to come in and open fire. And as you can see, 4 students are killed in Kent State, 2 in Jackson State, 2 African American students. And this is just boiling over in America. Students are dying because they are showing their distrust in the government and they don't support this war effort. So things are starting to get really ugly for Richard Nixon. And then his boy at the bottom there, Henry Kissinger, again, secretively is trying to end the conflict by having secret negotiations with North Vietnam. And this eventually will pull through, but again, the government being secretive did not work for them here, right? It didn't work for them with the whole Tet Offensive for Lyndon Johnson. It didn't work out. He's gone, and Nixon is starting to kind of follow the suit and do the same thing. And obviously, Americans are showing their unhappiness with, the same kind of issues as before. All right, kids, we're almost there. So we're talking about, distrust in the government is growing and all these events are going down. They're leading to this, modern day sentiment of how people just don't trust their government. And things like the Tet Offensive with Lyndon Johnson, you have My Lai, the massacre, Americans killing the village there, the bombing of Cambodia and Laos. Today, people don't trust their government. Okay, if I were to ask the question right now in class, how many of you trust politicians? I don't think many of us would raise our hands. But if I asked that question in 1940, when FDR is president, people, I think, overwhelmingly would have agreed that they trust their government. So all these events are revealed in what's called the Pentagon Papers. It's a report that's leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, and this information from all these events, and it's only further dividing Americans and their relationship with the government since JFK, Lyndon Johnson, and Nixon. And this is not even talking about Watergate. This is all Vietnam related. So people are losing their trust in the government. So what can we do to prevent all this from happening again? We're going to pass the War Powers Act of 1973. Yes, it does sound familiar because there was a term for you a couple weeks ago during the World War II era. But the War Powers Act of 1941 was to give President Roosevelt unlimited power during World War II. The War Powers Act of 1973 gives or takes away power from the president because of things like the Gulf of Tonkin. So what does it do? The president must tell Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into a conflict. And if he does that, he can only send them for 60 days. After that, they have to come home if Congress doesn't approve. Congress either has to declare war or they don't. If they declare war, the troops can stay. If they don't, they have to come home. So that's a good thing because this is trying to learn from our mistakes of the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident, okay, where the president, Lyndon Johnson, had a blank check, metaphorically speaking, that he could wage war however he wanted to and end the conflict with unlimited power. So make sure you know the difference between the two War Powers Acts. 73 limit the powers of the president, whereas 1941 was to expand the powers of the president for FDR. So how does the whole thing come to an end? Ultimately, Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization, withdrawing the troops, giving the fight back to the Vietnamese, widening the war in Laos and Cambodia, and the secret negotiations with Kissinger and North Vietnam, they all come to a head in what we call the Peace Accords 1973. A ceasefire is signed. The U.S. and the North Vietnamese, they stop shooting. The U.S. agrees that we will withdraw and that they will have free elections to support possibly democracy or communism once we leave. By 1975, we are out of Vietnam. Unfortunately, once we leave, all of the Vietnam is reunited, but as a communist country. and the free elections do not happen. This is a huge blow to American morale, and obviously people are going to say, what was the purpose of us being there? This was such a failure. America's never lost the war, and now we have. How do we lose to such a small country? All of our technology and our power after World War II, how did this happen? So lessons learned from Vietnam are going to come up in future events we'll talk about next week, and things like the Persian Gulf War and modern day. But Vietnam, what's the legacy? That's up to you. What is it? What did we learn from it? Was it good? Should we have been there? Those are all questions that I can't answer for you. That's something that everybody and every historian answers for themselves. All right, let's finish this off strong. So finally, last thing to know about Nixon is he supports détente. Okay, détente is a term that you learned last year. It's a term we briefly mentioned this year. Détente means a relaxation of Cold War tensions. So how exactly does Nixon pull off détente? Well, also adding to the Cold War tensions. So obviously adding to Cold War tensions, we just talked about how he expands the war with Laos and Cambodia, but at the same time, he is working very hard to take advantage of the Soviets and the Chinese split in philosophy on communism. They had been best buds when China fell to communism because they were the two first countries to really do that. But now, over the years, you see what we call a Sino-Soviet split, and Nixon tries to take advantage of that relationship deteriorating by visiting China to visit with Mao Zedong in 1972. And although it's just a visit and we're just talking to them, we formally will wind up opening up diplomatic relations and trading with them in the Jimmy Carter administration, 79. So that's a good step. And Nixon will be the first guy to travel to the Soviet Union as well. So those are nice steps in the Cold War. So he is certainly following through on détente. Now, to further that theme, he is going to sign with the Soviets two different things: the limiting anti-ballistic missiles and also the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or the SALT Treaty. And both of these are trying to limit the amount of missiles or nuclear weapons that each of us are building, which is significant for the whole Cold War arms race because now we are seeing finally a president trying to put into legislation the limiting of these nuclear weapons that can end the world, right, to prevent another Cuban Missile Crisis again. So this is a big win for Nixon. This is a huge step in the Cold War. Lastly, okay, kind of not really related to much we've talked about here, but just the side note is that the Warren Court, okay, is going to come to an end soon. Earl Warren, if you remember, we mentioned him last week as being the guy who Truman placed in the Supreme Court. He nominated him, and he becomes Chief Justice who will oversee cases like the Brown versus the Board of Ed case. Here are a couple of cases that he oversees as well. I'm not going to say you have to know them because there are only a few Supreme Court cases that we need to know for this course, and I will not say any of these are major, but you can see that all of these have a major theme, and that they're either civil rights related or they give rights to those of the accused, the criminal justice system. But other than that, we're going to close the book on this chapter. Chapter 20 is in the books. I hope this video helped. Please email me with any questions, and stay tuned to Edmodo for assignments for testing and things like that. All right. Have a great day, guys. Bye.